Namaskar. I welcome you all to our interview session organized by Ekhon Bangla Kabitar Kagaj. On behalf of magazine, I welcome Elizabeth Willis. My interaction with Elizabeth started during the translation project Visible Lines, an anthology of borderless poetry with 12 American poets. Including Elizabeth, Charles Bernstein, Peter Gizzi, uh, then Murat Nemetnejar, Mimi Barsenbragi, Eli Mindes, etc. Elizabeth, along with Murat and Adina Karasi, visited India for the book launch event of the anthology, organized by Ohik Putrika, held during the International Book Fair, Kolkata Book Fair in 2019. Apart from the book launch, a reading session was arranged by for these poets during the book fair by the magazine Notun Kobita, edited by Shapon Roy and Ranjan Moitra, and another magazine, Ekhon Bangla Kabitar Kagaj, edited by Untitled Bandyopadhyay. This magazine has arranged this interview session today. I briefly introduce Elizabeth. Elizabeth Willis is an American poet and literary critic. Her earliest years were spent in Bahrain, and she received her PhD in 1994 from the program in poetics at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And she has won the National Poetry Series, the Penn New England Award, and the Boston Review Prize for Poetry. In addition, she has received fellowship from the California Arts Council, the Walter N. Hayder Foundation, and the Howard Foundation. She is the author of several poetry books, and her book, Alive, was finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. She also edited the essay collection Radical Vernacular, Laurie Nideker and the Poetics of Place, published from Iowa University Press in 2008. Although she teaches poetry and poetics at Wesleyan University, she is most interested in the places where craft breaks down into something beyond it, and in the ways that attention can transform the most ordinary activities into art. Now, Elizabeth, I request you tell us the initial formation of your poetic life. When you started to feel that only through poetry you could express yourself. Please, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Runa, and namaskar. Is it okay if I just take a moment before we begin on questions, just to thank you and the Kolkata literary community, the poetry community. Coming to Kolkata for the book fair and experiencing your community was had a very profound effect on me, and I will always be grateful to you for that. It was to you and to Aritra Sanyal also, and to the other poets of West Bengal. So thank you. So I guess that's a way of saying that I think my poetic development is continuing. I hope it is continuing. And I'm not sure entirely how to answer the question of how I began, because, you know, I noticed in your recent interview with Regis Bonvicino that he was talking about really his his trajectory as an adult and his the ways that his work developed, through his publications. And I think a poetic sensibility begins in all kinds of ways. I think in some ways the most, influential piece of my youth was that I was not born in the United States. So I was born on the island of Bahrain, and where my father was working as a geologist. And so I was hearing language, I was coming into consciousness and coming into language with sounds other than English around me. And so I think feeling language more than understanding it, and hearing the music of the line before I knew what the meaning of the line was. And in some ways, that's how all children are, because we don't come into the world speaking the language of our parents. We're always trying to piece together meaning. And so I'm interested in the ways that poetry can keep us at that threshold of curiosity in which we continue to hear the melodies and all the complexity of language that goes beyond the meaning. As adults, we're so trained to just listen for the meaning and to get it as quickly as possible. And for me, poetry has always been about staying in the complexity that includes music and all kinds of other things. So the other part of that is that my father, because he was a geologist, he did two kinds of reading. Well, first of all, he wrote poetry secretly, so that was interesting. But also he taught me about two different kinds of reading, and one was reading the terrain, reading the landscape, and the other was reading depth. So part of his work was to analyze, it was called mud logging, analyzing the core samples that came up from the earth and understanding what that meant, reading the story of what that meant. And so when we traveled, when I was young, both my parents came from the American West, with lots of wide open space. He would read, he would say, here you can see the history. So a mountain wasn't, just something to be in awe of, but he could see it as a piece of history. It was speaking in some way. So that had a big impact on me. I had a sister who was 5 years older than I was, and she gave me books by Emily Dickinson when I was young. But I think really when I started to learn how to make letters, I started making poetry rather than narrative. So it always kind of made sense to me as a way of interacting with the world. So I guess, when I got to be an adult, I went to Buffalo for graduate school. I won't stay in my childhood, although I still feel like I'm still in my poetic childhood in some ways. I went to Buffalo to study with Robert Creeley, and I think that the ethos of the Black Mountain School and the New American Poetry had a big impact on me. And then there was Charles Bernstein was there, and Susan Howe, and I became more familiar with language poetry. But all the way through that, actually, beginning when I was a teenager, I was interested in a group of painters called the Pre-Raphaelites. And I was hoping I could show you some slides, but I don't think it will work. But what I was interested in with the Pre-Raphaelites was that they had a particular technique and practice that involved putting a bright white pigment on the canvas before they put down the color. And it was a very painstaking process. What effect that had was that it appeared the light was shining through the paint. It was illuminated. Everything was illuminated. And they did that for all of the background as well as for the central figures. So in the Renaissance, you have all this attention on the central figures of a painting and on the basic geometry of it. But the Pre-Raphaelites were interested in kind of returning to a more medieval sensibility in which you could see multiple times represented on the same canvas, and where the background might be as compelling and interesting as the foreground. So as you can probably hear, in many ways, I think that movement was the first avant-garde of Western art history. And it was something that I immediately connected with Charles Bernstein about, because he was also interested in this. And I'm interested in the ways that by looking back, by unlearning certain things like unified perspective, you can find a richer field kind of unfolding. So again, I think in your interview with Regis, he was talking about parataxis, the importance of parataxis. So that's just one thing and another, and it's not drawing conclusions about what you should pay attention to or what is the climax. And that was also, very much important to me in my reading of art. And, for me, that was the beginning of modernism, and it was really happening, 60 years before history says it was happening. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Your second law, that book was published by Avenue B. It's a book-length poem, and in 1993 it was published, and where you use that language poetry conventions in subversive ways. So I know your association with the language poets like Charles Bernstein, Susan Hill, as you told, Robert Greeley, Ron Silliman, etc. But you don't like to be recognized as a language or post-language poet. I would like to know is there any effect of language poetry on your poetic world, and in which way your departure from the language poetry?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't think the language poets think of me as a language poet either. So it's interesting. My sense is that poets of my generation who are really coming historically, in kind of settler time, in chronological time, just after the language poets, by the time we were coming into print, language poetry was being taken up by the Academy. So it had already moved from the margins, or it was in the process of moving from the margins of American literary consciousness to the institutional centers. So that happened in part with, Charles coming to Buffalo. And I think that was part of Robert Creeley's kind of forward thinking about language poetry as sort of embracing what was next. And Susan Howe was really important. I feel like they were doing very important work in terms of kind of wrenching poetry free from the unified perspective and kind of self-celebration that seemed to be a part of confessional poetry. So to me, that was the most important thing about it. And I think because the poets of my generation were sort of seeing the ways that institutions accommodate, take in, in this way that is, kind of problematic. They incorporate the avant. They're constantly incorporating some of the edges of things. And so I think there was a real resistance in my generation to sort of naming ourselves. And I think if you say post-language poetry, that suggests that language poetry is over. And I don't think that's true. So I think there was more, what I see in my generation is more an interest in sort of having the attention to language and surface that comes with language poetry, but also embracing the possibilities of, say, the invisible world. We're not focused on the material in quite the same way. But that was also true of Susan Howe, who has a kind of almost incantatory aspect of her work as well. Yeah.
Okay. Now you told nicely. Now I will come to your book, Alive. That was published by New York Review Book in 2015. And it was finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. Elizabeth, we would like to listen your poetry now, please.
Okay. We had talked about maybe my reading a Steady Digression.
That is later on.
Later on. Okay. A couple of shorter poems. Is that what you were thinking? Okay. All right. Let's see. I'll read you the very last poem in Alive, and it's called About the Author. And I think, for me, mishearing things or misinterpreting things is often a very rich territory. So this poem began in a kind of, as a response to various things, thinking about poets like Oppen and Rimbaud, who had a kind of masculine quality, and also this is, I'll wait. I'll, if you would like, I can talk about the poem afterward. Okay, about the author. About her, the air warm as fact. An imaginary boat heading off to hell, her foot pushing it offshore. The sunlit bank, a mirage of the perfect past. She was barking at the waves, thinking they barked first. But this was not a river. It was Thursday, a word cast in lead. Her eye had turned the water into sky. The poet is a trespasser. The poet is the king of Rome, New York, with one foot in a boat and one against the snowy shore of reason, wondering if, like a boy, she could go there for a season. So I guess I would just say,
Nice. Very nice.
Thank you.
You please read some more.
Read another one? Okay. Perhaps I'll read this other one that is also a short poem that's a kind of response to Shakespeare, but really kind of using Shakespeare to write a different sort of poem, using his form. So this is Sonnet 63 and a half. Against love's battle lies ungrammatical, inevitable meadow, a future tensed of all its past. So time may take this beauty down, but beauty will fight itself to death. The vampire day, top heavy, white, erase, erased, erasing. A grieved belief, he was my east and west. He bound my breasts, I cut his hair. I lay my words upon his mouth, my mouth upon I cannot say. All of grace is not device. Love loves its past, but not its thief. May all its punishments remain untamed upon this green unsentencing.
Very nice. Wonderful. You can read some more poems.
I don't know if I'm prepared to read more. Well, all of the poems that I'm choosing to read, actually, these shorter ones, in fact, I think most of the poems I'll be reading today are are in a kind of call and response relation to other artists. And so that, but I should say that's only one part of what I think about poetry, but here it is. This is based on a painting by Willem de Kooning, a very early work called Self-Portrait with Imaginary Brother. Eventually, the imaginary brother becomes a wife or a lover, a daughter or a wife. A woman sitting, 1943, is sitting in the middle of a war. The breast that is showing does not appear to be loved. It lives in a society of thieves, no hands. Even the pink lady isn't pink. She's a head full of teeth. Now it's 1948. Painters may not be trembling, but the world is. Turned over, the secretary is a piece of furniture, her paint running upward impossibly from the face. She'll do anything you say.
Wonderful. You did very nicely. I remember one of the poem of your Alive named Steady Digression as to a Fixed Point, which is the name of the autobiography of the famous Hollywood actress of 20th century, Rose Hubbard, who was blacklisted as communist because of her agitation to improve the working condition for actors in Hollywood. You have dedicated your poem to Rose Hubbard and the surrealist film director Joseph Cornell, who made his experimental film about Rose Hubbard. Elizabeth, could you please tell us your experience about this poem that links with the actress Threshold Crossing Resistance and the movie of Joseph Cornell? Please.
Yeah, I would be happy to. I wish I could show you some images, but you can find them online. I'll tell you, one thing that interests me about Rose Hobart is the ways that you can see Joseph Cornell thinking about the rose. So the rose within American modernism is this kind of emblem, symbol that several modernist poets returned to as a way of thinking about a really traditional poetic image that they wanted to make new. So Gertrude Stein has rose is a rose is a rose. William Carlos Williams has the poem The Rose, in which a rose kind of explodes. And Joseph Cornell was making collages of, like, there's a rose that's kind of serving as the motor to push a ship forward. And he was making these collages at the same time that in the early 30s that this movie East of Borneo came out. And Rose Hobart, who was a stage actress in New York that Cornell admired, had gone to Hollywood. There's Rose Hobart. That's one of her later images. And so anyway, Cornell saw this, there we go, this B movie. Really, East of Borneo is a very, sort of Orientalist, not high budget, very low budget film. And the part of it that's interesting is not the, sort of explorers, like desire to conquer the East, but it's Rose Hobart who mostly appears in the film in her reaction shots. You see her thinking about something, and so there's a way that her presence is very much kind of an undercurrent that overturns this kind of colonial narrative that is being presented in the film. So what Joseph Cornell did is he got a copy of East of Borneo and he extracted images of Rose Hobart from it. So he made this beautiful film called Rose Hobart. And my poem kind of came out of that. There's also a couple of odd things about that. The first time that he showed the film, Salvador Dali exploded and said, "You've stolen these images out of my head." And it was so frightened Cornell that he stopped making films for a period of time. So that way that it kind of works on the psyche is interesting, but yeah.
This rededication to a fixed point is one of the poems I translated for the anthology. This is a long poem. I would like to read a part of the poem in my translation. একটা গোলাপ বিশ্ব বদলে দিতে পারে না, শুধু মুক্ত বা বদ্ধ করতে পারে। একটা গোলাপ বিশাল গিয়ারের মতো বিশ্বকে পরিচালিত করে, জাহাজকে ঠেলে দেয় বর্নিয়র পূব দিকে। একটা শরীর পুনর্বিন্যস্ত হলে এক সূত্রে বাঁধা পড়ে একটা গোলাপের সাথে। গোলাপ এক অস্ত্র, এক পথপ্রদর্শক, একটা কম্পাস। উপচে পড়া নীল কিনার দেখাতে কাজ ভেঙে ফেলে। আর এভাবেই জানতে পারি আমরা এক ট্র্যাজেডির সম্মুখীন। তোমার এমন হওয়া উচিত ছিল না, তোমার এমন হতে পারে না, তবু তুমি করেছিলে, সে তুমি। আমরা পরিণামের টুকরোগুলো জড়ো করি। তুমিই সে, যেভাবে আমরা নিজেদের সঙ্গে কথা বলি। আমরা একজন আমি, যে নিজেকে দেখে অন্যদের ভেতর। একটা সমাবেশ আমিকে করে আমরা। সমাবেশ একটা শরীর, যা থেকে রেহাই নেই। একটা ভালো, একটা মিম, অন্ধকারে ঘুরে মরা এক সম্ভাবনা। একটা লোক মেয়েটাকে স্টেজে তুলে দিল। কোন জাদুতে সে শুধুমাত্র শিল্পীদের জন্য নিজেকে টুকরো করে মেরে দিল আমাদের চোখের সামনে? শরীর এক প্রথাগত বাধা, যার একটাই জীবন, অনন্ত গড়ার জন্য। শিল্পরূপ আমাদের নিজেদেরই প্রতিমূর্তি। বাঁধন খোলো, বিলম্বিত করো, গোলাপিত করো। আমি তোমার নাম লিখছি একটা বাগানে, ক্যামেরা বক্সে। অতীতের সবকিছু, পটভূমির সবকিছুই অনিশ্চিত। ঘর বাড়ি, জঙ্গল, বিলাসবহুল খোদিত দেয়াল, রোজ শত্রুর মুখ অস্ত্রহীন করে। এমনকি রত্নখচিত রাজপুত্র বশীভূত হয় ফুলেরও বিকাশে। রোজের নিসর্গে সবকিছুই ছিল, কিন্তু মুছে দেয়া হয়েছিল অন্তর্মহলের মানচিত্র দেখাতে। রোজ উদ্বিগ্ন, রোজ মদ খায়, বানরটাকে শিশুর মতো কোলে করে। রোজ লোকটার বাহুতে ধরা দেয়, অস্পষ্ট দাসত্বের ইঙ্গিতে পোশাকিত হয়, আর সুট বুটে নিজেকে সাজায়। রোজ কি করবে ভাবতে গিয়ে সামনে না দেখে ভেতর দেখে। নিজস্ব প্রতিফলন নিয়ে তার সংগ্রাম। রোজ মুক্তির জন্য সেজে ওঠে। রোজ নতুন বিবাহিত মেয়ের মতো টেবিল ক্লথ সামলায় অস্থির ভাবে। রোজ সূর্যকে মিনতি করে। রোজ জুতো পরেই ঘুমোয়। এই রূপের জন্যই জমকালো পোশাকের রাজপুত্র তার প্রেমে পড়ে। মঞ্চের ওপর বিছানা, যা দ্বীপগুলোর মধ্যে সবচেয়ে প্রকাশ্য। রোজ বিপদের সামনে, কিন্তু সঙ্গীত ভেদ করে তার স্বর শোনা যায় না। নিউ ইয়র্ক অস্পষ্ট হতে থাকে, সরে সরে যায় বহু দূরে। সে জেগে থাকে সারা রাত, অদৃশ্য হতে থাকে। গ্রহণের সি ও রোজ যখন জঙ্গল থেকে দূরে সরে যায়, পার্টিতে থাকে না, সে তখন চেষ্টা করে তারকাদের সংগঠিত করার। রোজ কোন রাষ্ট্রের শত্রু, তার মুখ থেকে নাম বের করতে পারে না তারা। আহা, অমার্কিনী বিউটি গোলাপ সমস্ত বাধা পেরিয়ে উঠতে থাকে, যতক্ষণ না সব শেষ হয়ে যায়। গোলাপ রঙের ভবিষ্যতে কোনো সাক্ষী থাকে না। ক্যামেরা বক্সের বিশুদ্ধ বিশৃঙ্খলায় এক গোলাপ বাগান, যা আমাদের বলে না মৃত্যুর সময়টা নিয়ে কিভাবে চিন্তা করব, বরং এর ভেতর একটা যথেষ্ট বড় গর্ত তৈরি করতে চায়, যার ভেতর দিয়ে সূত্রটাকে নিয়ে যাওয়া যায়। এক নারীকে তার গোলক ধাঁধা থেকে বের করে আনার জন্য যথেষ্ট লম্বা করতে চায়। আমরা একটা কথোপকথনের চেষ্টা করছি। তুমি যেসব শব্দ বলেছিলে সেগুলো লিখে রাখতে চাই, কিন্তু সবকিছুই পণ্ড হলো। রোজ হবার তোমার প্রতি তার ভালোবাসা, গোলাপদের নৃত্য নিয়ে লেখা একটা কবিতা, একটা চলচ্চিত্র যা গোলাপে বিকশিত। It's a long poem, so I would, Elizabeth, what I always experience with your poems is that it tries to make a cultural communicative bridge with its words, images, and rhythms. Your aesthetic and poetic ethics are inseparable, I feel, and composing a dynamic relationship with the world, society, its cultural heritage. So, poetry and poets are always under the question of its social responsibility. I would like to ask you whether a poet is responsible to the society or himself or herself. Please.
Thank you. I think that's a great question, and a question that a lot of people are feeling more urgently now than at other times. But I think poets are responsible to themselves. Poets are also responsible to poetry, and poetry needs to survive all the upheavals of social and political life. So at the same time, I do think that there is a responsibility that I don't know if I would even think of it necessarily as social, because I think when we think of social responsibility, it's usually just about content. I think the social responsibility of poetry is not to be boring, and to give people a place to go that is nourishing, which means not reinforcing the views that they already come to a poem with, but continuing to open the mind to remain curious. So it's, for me, it's not so much about messaging, but I think, in a poem like Rose Hobart, for me, a lot of what drove me was my appreciation for Joseph Cornell's repurposing of this film that was really, kind of in the service of colonial politics in a certain way. And so he performs a rescue of this star who was a labor organizer in Hollywood, became a labor organizer, and suffered for it. And so I think there is a kind of social mission within that I think, again, has to do with not using poems to reinforce the status quo, but to put before us work that is exciting, and that, again, I think the notion of repurposing and collage is part of that. But I also think beyond the social, there's a responsibility of the poet to the world at large. Like I think there's a contractual relationship between poets and forests, because trees are used to make books. And if we're not aware of the materials, the cost to the planet to use these resources in this particular way, then we're not taking in the total picture. So that's why I say I think poetry has a responsibility not to be boring or not to be self-serving, because that's a waste of resources from my perspective. So I think the more I've gone in that direction, actually, the less I've published, because I think, it's not it's not about just coming out with a book every couple of years. It's about feeling like there's something important to say. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Wonderful. I like your thought. A lot of audiences has come. I just read their name and comments. Pranab Kumar De, welcome. Eagerly waiting to hear from both of you. Welcome to Elizabeth also. Shubham Karpal, it's a great opportunity to know about the new poem of USA from Elizabeth. Devashish Mukhopadhyay. Thanks Ekhon Bangla Kabitar Kagaj to give us such opportunity. Otanu Bandyopadhyay, who is the organizer of this Ekhon Bangla Kabitar Kagaj, this interview session. Welcome Elizabeth Willis and both of us. Ekhon Bangla Kabitar Kagaj is grateful to you for such an interview session. And Sudip Ghoshal, Shubhecha Roilo, welcome. And Sudip, Otanu Bandyopadhyay, about your poetry, it's very beautiful. Aurobindo Maji, good evening to both of us. Then Shubham Karpal, what is the era of postmodern poem? Pranab Kumar Mukhopadhyay, translation is lovely translation. Want to read the original one? It's wonderful poetry. Yeah, your original poem. It's a very long poem. If we get time, we can read in steady declaration. Okay. Now we will go to our next, your book. I want to go to your next book, Human Abstract. That was published by Penguin in 1995 and selected for National Poetry Series. Human Abstract is William Blake's iconic poem to draw the symbolic image of the modern human. About 2 centuries ago, William Blake, the visionary poet, could feel the real picture of the modern human and realize that human being detached from his original form makes his own abstract image for his own existence as a fence of his own security under the veil of the universal human sentiment. As we know that the human is always figural and the abstract is non-figural in terms of visual composition. But you always take the challenge to think of the two things in two different ways at the same time. Could you please tell us what this figuration means in your poetry? Elizabeth.
Yeah, again, that's a wonderful question. I do think poetry is a great form for holding contradiction. So I am very interested in the notion of not giving up either abstraction or figuration. I think if we think that we can get rid of figuration, it's not possible because we write as individuals. So that, I think, is always there shaping the work, that it's coming from a human voice. But it's also always participating in these kind of symbolic orders that, you know, have their own life. So part of what interests me about Blake is that because he was writing illuminated books, you can actually see how each page is, you know, it is visual art and it is a poem. The poem, The Tiger, has a tiger and a tree, and they're completely intertwined with the language of the poem. And I think that's kind of, it's a perspective that I appreciate. And I think it has to do with, again, understanding the human as an animal within this much larger system, and who has responsibilities for how it is represented, particularly in bringing forth kind of voices that otherwise would be ignored by the kind of higher, organizational structures. So the other thing about the abstract is that an abstract as a literary form is a condensation of a much larger thing, and so there's that sense of the abstract too, almost like a blueprint. Yeah, so I'm interested in combining, say, figuration and landscape. Yeah.
I would like to come to your next book, Address. It received Penn New England Prize and published by Wesleyan University Press in 2011. You explore the multiplicity of meanings and association of poetry with politics, art, social awareness. Uh, I remember our radical poet Shapun Roy, one of the renowned poets in the new poetry genre of Bengali literature, whom you met in the same poetry reading session of Kolkata Book Fair. In reference to this topic, I would like to read a small poem, uh, what he read in this poetry reading session. A presumed boatman song is love, not smoke. A company limited in privacy is smoke, not love. CD winter is love, smoke. Mokshedlo. This I think Shapunda refers to the Russian folk song, the Song of the Volga Boatman, to compare the love of the Russian laborers to the smoke of the laborers in company limited in privacy in the present day society. So actually, moksha is a Sanskrit word, the philosophical concept of freedom from the cycle of life and death. Shakunta plays his acoustic poetic game with the homophonic Sanskrit word love, which means the to achieve, and the English word love, L-O-V, love, with the addition of smoke. Then he adding smoke and love, he made a new word like moksheblo. Uh, so with a striking misarrangement of letters, which has no semantic meaning, but creates an oblique reference to the philosophical concept of moksha, to make the internal force of the poem that drives the reader to ascertain what the freedom is. So this my thought may not be matching with the poet or the other readers. And so to speak, that a poem triggers the reader's imagination in a multidimensional way. The meaning becomes palpable suddenly, like a flash of lightning, uh, sudden resonance in our mind only for a few moments. So I would like to mention like Wittgenstein. If the meaning has occurred to you, now you know it, and the knowing began when it occurred to you. Like meaning in a poetry is found not by not by extracting, but by responding to it. As Charles Bernstein says in his early book, early essay, The Dollar Values of Poetry. I would like to know from you, Elizabeth, your views about your readers, the active participators of your poems, who actually mind the meanings, that multiplicity of meanings. Please.
Yeah, well, first of all, I love that poem by Swapan Roy, and the ways that it moves between positive and negative space, what something is and is not. And I'm fascinated by that kind of performative sense of language. When you say something, even if you say it is like, this is not a pipe, you have brought into the imagination a pipe, even as you also take it away. So I think that sort of magic, that sleight of hand, is a really, really interesting aspect of poetry. How you can make something, you can rearrange the letters for love and smoke and make this other entity. And move between what is concrete and what is dissolving, as the echo of a poem will dissolve over time. Yeah, I think it's language is it's a shared medium. I mean, in this it's very different from say painting, because we're using language right now. Every word is shaped by its use, and so every reader will have associations built into like every word that they've ever heard before, because it has a place in their timeline, in their kind of physical memory. And so I think, it's interesting to me to think about how a poem might be sort of touching on, like a bell, a sound that exists within a reader and may exist differently, but yeah, it has to do with kind of pulling all the etymological and kind of associative resonance of a word with it. And also the syntax is really interesting. Yeah, I also kind of have an affinity for this. It's almost an algebraic thinking about this is not this, sort of thinking about how the mechanics of a poem make a world within the poem. Yeah.
You have a question. Can you read it?
How language, who, are you asking me to read it or the?
Pranab Kumar Dey has questioned you how landscape and painting inspired Elizabeth in her groundbreaking poetry, if she says something about it.
Yeah, well, I will say, so one of my books was titled Turner-esque. And again, there's a sort of pun because it's pointing to two Turners, J.M.W. Turner, who was a great landscape and seascape painter of the 19th century, and Ted Turner, who was a cable television mogul. So there are poems that are about film and poems that draw from painting in it. But what interested me about Turner was that in these seascapes, if you want to Google, say, I think it's called Snowstorm at Sea, you can see how the ground, even in a landscape representation, the ground in these seascapes is very disorienting. And I think that's a useful disorientation because we arrive here in a state of not knowing. I think it's exciting. Part of what's exciting about experimental poetry is coming to the site of the poem with curiosity and with a recognition of one's not knowing, and experiencing a reorientation through the mechanisms of the poem. I don't know if that helps.
So, can you please read again some poetry? We are interested to listen from.
Okay, from address, maybe?
Anything.
Okay. Well, okay, so I'll read two poems from address that are sort of in, I think, relate to what we were talking about in Swapan Roy's poem. This one is called Classified. I don't know if you have, I assume everybody has in the newspaper a section of classifieds where it's, sort of requests for particular things or that sort of thing.
Which book?
This is from Address.
Okay.
Yeah. We'll trade fountain pen for outboard motor, a trembling nightfall for government bonds. We'll trade this grievance for a moment of silence, that wooded tavern for my aimless youth. We'll trade potable water for loyal army, Fabergé egg for interpretation of dreams. We'll trade heirloom lilacs for 3 cords of wood. We'll trade this meadow for a person-sized piece of shade. We'll trade fluttering leaf for a career in baseball. We'll trade class warfare for a place to lay my head. We'll trade a life of crime for a month in the country, a decorative pear for a clean, dry pillow, a wheelbarrow for an end to all that. Should I read one more? Or
one more, please.
One more? Okay, this is In Strength, Sweetness, which, uses a different device. In strength, sweetness, in the wind, an inky air, in the air, finchness, in the ink, a stone. In the winter, winter, in the nest, in the piney, in the tree, filigree, in the great, by and by. In the worm, William Blake, in the fall, fortune, in the ocean, a figure, in canvas, the grain, in the apartment, a body, in the mountain, its making, in the cottage, a fable, in the mind, its miniature, in the seed, a sun, in the fist, a question, in the question, an expedition, in the expedition, a bank, in the dollar, a seal, in the seal, another seal, in the sand, a massacre, in the blood, spirit, in the word, your mouth, in the tail, its labyrinth, in the lion, the V, in the bee, a plane, in the plan, a city, in your city, its anger, in your anger, a harbor, in your harbor, a boat, in the boat, open sea.
Wonderful. I always think that a poem is not the carrier of words, tunes, musical measures or tempos, but the conveyor of the poet's own experience of reality in the midst of our hyper-real world, and achieved knowledge through the expansive space of his or her awakened consciousness. So I feel that all events are reflections or resonance that manifest themselves through words. Again, resonance is not object but occurrence, where associations are related to probabilities that cannot be expressed directly but through imagination. So that may be the reason why the language poetry movement argued for a poetry that did not use word instrumentally, but rather created a non-purpose driven aesthetic space that allowed for pleasure in reflection, projection, and sensory engagement with verbal materials, as you told, and where the imagination of readers is thus activated. The poet's reality is a queer and mysterious. Reality comes before mind and matter, and reality conceives mind and helps us to realize its existence. Yet reality is imperceivable. Within the boundaries of matters, within the reason of mind, only multidimensional, counterfactual reflections can be felt deep in our heart of the consciousness. So about this topic, I remember Parin Ghoshal writing in his book Guinea Pig. This is a guinea pig, a documentary film. It's a collection of theoretical polemics which he writes during the core of literary movement in Bengal, contemporary to language poetry movement. I would like to few lines of this from this book. From all possibilities conceivable of an incident or an event that happened, it can be said that only a single possibility took a concrete shape and immediately became unreal, leaving the other possibilities or potentials in mind at the level of imagination, which are real to a being. That is, only those belong to a person. Thus, distinguishing between realities and unrealities, we tell ourselves that we live in abstract realities and imagination and ignore the fantastic, unreal world around us. Elizabeth, with this reference, I would like to ask you uh, how this desire to dismantle the standard perception of reality and to blur the boundaries between imagination and reality, thought and perception works in your portrait.
Hmm. Wow, that's a challenging question. I don't know if I can say how it works, but I think that there's an interplay between thought and feeling. I'm interested in the notion of embodied understanding and the fact that, you know, if you're a pianist, your fingers have knowledge in them about where to go. It's a muscle memory. And I think in that way, the body is, you know, what HD would call a palimpsest or Freud would call a palimpsest. All of these meanings are layered. All of our experiences are layered there. And we can go to different points of depth in that, and our imagination is also always working with that material. And so I think you know, you were talking about reality coming first. I think reality comes it comes in both ways. I think there is a reality we are born into that we are kind of trying to sort out, but I also think that there is a reality that we make. And I think that the more open we are about what that reality could be, the sort of better the world would be. I mean, you know, if everything has to make sense, then we're, you know, it's like the Dadaists were sort of saying in World War I, if this level of violence is what logic has brought us to, then give us non-logic. So I think that's why, for me, the act of listening is as important as the act of writing. And the more kind of acute our listening, I think the more powerful our poetry.
Shapon Rai has joined our show, and he said, hi Elizabeth, nice to see you after a long time. How are you?"
Very nice to see you.
We
Well, I can't
are,
see you. It's very nice to know you're there.
yes,
Yeah.
I can see the clock is ticking. It is very difficult to explore a versatile poet like Elizabeth in a short time. We have to sit again with Elizabeth. If you like to tell something for our organizer, Ekhon Bangla Kabitar Kagaj, Elizabeth, please.
Oh, I would just like to thank you so much for including me in this show. I'm really honored to be part of your community.
Well, we are at the end. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining with us. And my special thanks to all our audience, without whom the session would not have been exciting and interesting. And I sincerely appreciate your time and attention. And I look forward to your presence in our next interview session. Namaskar.
Thank you so much. Namaskar.